If you made it this far into the video, type Camo Panther in the comments. VIP of Bizarre Interesting Productions again, and let's talk about Kamen Rider again. No, I haven't watched Gav yet. Gottschalk brought out the worst in the community, and I still need time before I go back to working on those scripts. That being said, before the month ends, which it did end in February, which is why this is being recorded in March when I wrote it in February, there's a video I've been wanting to do for years now. Let's talk about the first black. No, not black colored, but the first African American Kamen Riders and see how they were handled. Let's go with the character who chronologically appeared first, Grant Staley and Van, his Ventaran counterpart and the original owner of the Kamen Rider Advent deck from Kamen Rider Dragon Knights. So let's start with his character. In his debut episode, Kamen Rider Camo, before being recruited by Xavier X, was an underground martial artist who cheated in his karate fights against his sensei by hiding a wrench inside of his glove. After being caught and exposed for cheating, our big bad himself, Xavier X, recruited Grant by the same way he recruits everyone else he can't completely trust. Take an alias named Race Maddock. Race Black. Nah, I'm just messing with you there. But seriously, Xavier X pretends to be Race and offer him the opportunity to take more challenges. After Grant is shown the logistical combat sensor featuring Wing Knight, Grant heads off in pursuit of his target, Len, or Wing Knights. Unfortunately, Grant ran into Kit and Drew, our protagonist, and Guy working with Xavier X to try to manipulate Kit respectively. Technically, all of them are against Wing Knight, even though Kit and Grant really shouldn't be, but semantics. Grant, being Grant, tells them that he's the only one that can defeat Wing Knight and no one else can beat him other than him. So Grant and Drew transform and fight with him becoming Kamen Rider Camo. Using his combat skills, the Bio-Winder yo-yo weapon born from his Advent beast, he's able to fight them off, mostly able to fight off Toric, Drew swarm for a while until Launch Vent is able to break up the fights. Afterwards, Kit tries to motivate him to join them since they're all on the same side, but Drew tries to get Kit to attack Camo, and more so sensing a disadvantage, Grant uses Clear Vent to turn invisible and escape. In the next episode, Kamen Rider Thrust, he watched the fight between Wing Knight and Thrust, but on the way he met Drew and Kit, with him finally realizing anyone who's after Wing Knight is also the ones working with Xavier X, including Drew. Meanwhile, Camo and Toric fought again. Kit was far too late to stop the fight as Toric activated his final vent, and for the first time, the Zolda suit finishing move finally defeated another rider, and it'll never happen again. And so Grant got sent to the Advent Void. I just realized I haven't been able to explain the whole thing behind Kamen Rider, but if you're watching this video, you probably are a Kamen Rider fan, but if you're not, the Advent Void is basically like the Shadow Realm if it was actually a real plot point in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Dragon Knight, it was actually originally meant as a haven for the heroes before the big good of the series mysteriously disappeared, which was later revealed to have a reason why he disappeared. So he couldn't get them out, and thus any rider who suffered enough serious injuries to the point of death would be stuck in the Advent Void in a prison state that's far worse than death, since, it was made to save them, and now it's kind of their prison. He shows up in a few more flashbacks, but that's really the end of his character in terms of screen time. That big good I mentioned later, named Ubelon, is able to get his Ventaran counterpart Van out of the Advent Void. Yeah, long story short, the original heroes were betrayed by the original Dragon Knight, and Wing Knight was left with survivor's guilt. But thanks to everyone's efforts and Ubelon being brought back, thanks to Len finding him thanks to the No-Men, Van is able to transform into Camo, and with the rest of the riders, together they are able to defeat Xavier X and end them once and for all. The final episode basically says they returned most of the Earth Riders back to the original lives, so Grant in total technically only had about 3 episodes of screen time. On the bright side, in the novel, which is a sequel story that takes place after the original series that I haven't quite read yet, Grant does return after most of the Ventaran riders disappear. It turns out he became an MMA fighter, but when Kit recruits him to deal with the new threat, he signs up because being an MMA fighter was kind of boring for him. Now, I have the means to read the novel, but I haven't read it yet, and I need to change that before 2026. But at least he ended up in a better position than when he started. So, it's disappointing how he was handled a bit, but is this an example of racism? Not necessarily, unless you put into the implications that the first African-American Kamen Rider was a cheater. Yeah, at least he wasn't a thief. And technically, he is as sympathetic as the rest of the other writers. Remember, when you think about it for a second, all of the Earth Riders were only brought into a war they never really wanted to take place in, say for Drew and James, Toric and Strike, and if you watch Ryuki, Zolda and Oja's counterparts. All of them, including Camo, were tricked into it, and Grant was just another victim like the rest. The real problem comes down to a lack of budget and footage. Camo and his Ryuki counterpart Verde had about 4 cards. The Advent and Attack Vent for his beast Biogriza, the Hold Vent that summons a Bolas yo-yo weapon based on Biogriza's eyes, the Clear Vent allowing Camo to go invisible, the Copy Vent allowing him to copy his opponent's appearance and weapons, and the final vent, Death Punish. Yes, that is the name. Biogriza grabs Camo's legs with its tongue, swings him into the target for Camo to grab the launched airborne opponent, and spin around in midair before dropping him with a pile driver. Camo's Advent Beast, Copy Vent, and Final Vent were shown in Ryuki because Verde was introduced in a special for the show where he managed to end Sting and Wing Knight's counterparts, Raya and Knight respectively. Naturally, only having footage for the main detragonist and third protagonist meant that they could only use original footage for Camo. So it's less of the creators being racist and more of, we didn't have the money to use this and the footage we had was basically impossible to use. On the bright side, they're both in video games at least, so even though it's still disappointing, at least there's an opportunity for you to use the full moveset that the show couldn't provide. And the creators clearly wanted to do something more of him. According to an interview with Nathan Long with Henshin Justice, they asked him the question, there were a number of characters we only saw for a brief period of time. If given the opportunity, what characters would you have liked to explore more and why? And here's what one of the writers, Nathan Long, had to say. Grant Camo had a different story when we first wrote him. He was an eco-terrorist who uses rider powers to smash up polluting factories. Xavier set him against Kit and Len by saying they were working for the corporations. Sadly, there was no budget for smashing up factories, so he became a cheating martial artist. Heck, they implied that wasn't the only character. According to Long, the Cho brothers had a whole backstory where they were stealing to help their mom, who was about to lose the convenience store she ran out. Well, she was running because she couldn't pay the rent. Unfortunately, there was no money to shoot scenes in a convenience store and no money for actors to pay greedy landlords, so they just stole motorcycles. Though based on what Xavier talks to them about, with them being depraved upon being deprived, you do see elements of those backstories hinted in further detail. That actually also explains why Raph's human host wasn't seen that often. The website at the time explained that Nolan was a construction worker who fell into a coma after a job site accident, which, based on what we know from Xavier, he probably organized that, just like he did putting Kit's father into the hospital. What makes this cooler is that they actually wanted scenes where Xavier entered the hospital, smashing up people like the Terminator after possessing his body, but again, time and budget restricted that. Speaking of which, I found an interview with Christopher Barbers, his Grant actor, talking about Dragon Knight. He genuinely believed in the show and seemed pretty excited about being in the show in general. Christopher said in his words that Grant is a bit mixed up as a character. He seems like he has a good side really deep down, but he's focused on being number one, which that part is consistent with his character. He says hopefully in the future that Grant is actually able to open up and able to show this side. So clearly there were talks about using his character a bit more, but sadly it just didn't come to be. So let's talk about Ben and John, played by Michael Anthony Kinder, an African-American actor and dancer who was also Kamen Rider Lancer, with his partner John, the white guy played by Tom Constantine, a Japanese-based English actor, model, and stuntman. Both are the first Kamen Riders in the main franchise to be acted by a full African-American and Caucasian actor, and played supporting characters in Kamen Rider Geats, the fourth entry into the Raver series of Kamen Rider. I couldn't find much information on Michael, but I found a lot of Tom. He moved to Japan in 2014. He founded the Tokusatsu Network. He worked as a freelance translator. He founded Rival Sons as a stuntman agency in Japan for foreigners, retired from the network to work on his acting career. And I was able to find some details on Michael Kinder. He's got a bit of a martial artist background and at least understands stunt fighting. He participates in international dance as well, and there are some interviews that go into more detail if you look them up on YouTube and other sites. Either way, Ben and John were pretty well received in the American and Japanese fandom. Both are Neon's bodyguards that start off well-meaning obstacles to get Neon home, but they're not cool with her mom abusing her, but they also can't go against their boss. They also reveal in episode 14 that they would take Neon's side over her parents no matter what. Turned out to be Kamen riders in the past Desire Grand Prix, who survived at worst, and their ID cores were a white tiger for John and a black panther for Ben, because of course they were. So they seem well-liked, used pretty well for being supportive characters. So what seems to be the problem? Well, despite Grant's limited screen time, he actually had 2 episodes to act and fight as a Kamen Rider. Naturally, you'd think being fan favorites, Ben and John would transform and we'd get to their amazing fight on screen. Right? Right? Well, in episode 33, they finally get to transform in the Yearning arc to protect Neon. They get their cool poses, however, when they transform, the camera cuts away from their perspective, so when they do, their opponent Buffa is the only one we see. Then we see what happens at the end of the fight where both of them are defeated, never getting a chance to see their suits even once. Toei is never going to beat the racist allegations, are they? To make matters worse, in the exact same episode, the show used one of the suit actors to make another suit, or at least a headpiece with that person transformed and dying, but we barely knew anything about them other than their name, and because Ben and John got, well, soldier suspected, I'm not even going to give you the dignity who Toei figured deserved more screen time despite being a nobody. Still, they show up, like, that wasn't their last appearance in the show. And they end the series watching over Neon as her more consistently supportive parental figures, while she managed to get the love of her actual family back as well as a boyfriend at the end of the day. So, what can we learn from these 2 examples? In Camo's situation, I would say the problem wasn't inherently racism. It just happened to be the character who had the least amount of footage they can use on a show that didn't have a lot of money to begin with, and just be given an opportunity to be in at least a few episodes, and have that character still play a role in the story. Sometimes it's a case of extreme bad luck, but they didn't have to make them black, and yet they still chose to anyway. So I'm glad the actor and the writers were able to get the most out of the experience. And chronologically, he is the first African-American Kamen Rider, even if Dragon Knight isn't technically canon to the Japanese franchise. But it still counts as an adaptation. In a Kamen Rider Geet situation, though, this was just downright incompetent and laziness on Toei's end. Keep in mind, there was already a wolf head in the show with Kamen Rider Lobo, which they could have either made another mold of or repurposed to make it look like a tiger and a panther. So they built up the fact that these 2 are riders, and in the arc with the least amount of story going on, even if they couldn't give us a fight, they still went out of their way to give them a scene and not even give us the dignity of showing their suits. Even without a fight scene, the fans deserve that much, and I try not to be entitled because a lot of Kamen Rider fans can be entitled on what they think a series should be. But, like, if you set up a scene, you hype it up, and you show people and even set it up in the preview, why not just show it, even if you're not going to go out of the way to make an extensive fight scene? But yeah, as of when I'm writing this, Black History Month is either narrowing its end or it's Women's History Month, and I need to actually get this out instead of wasting it on my docs. And it was a good opportunity to talk about it since I didn't really see anyone else talk about it before, and for better or worse, these are important milestones in Kamen Rider's history.